Welcome back, guys. This is Nuno from Nuno Solutions. I'm going to show you guys how to create a save employee functionality on the Blazor WebAssembly application that we were building. So where we left off is we had a list of employees that's pulling from a SQL Server database, and we're able to click an edit button so you can see employee records in the edit form. So this is the list. If you click this edit button here, takes you to the edit employee screen, and you can see it loaded the employee that I clicked on. And we added this save employee button in the last video, but we haven't implemented this yet. So in this video, we're going to implement the save employee button. The first thing I want to do is this Swagger web page that keeps loading up every time I run the application. I want to just not load this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Visual Studio, and I'm going to go to the server-side project, the Nuno Solutions employees.server. I'm going to double-click on properties. Then I'm going to go to debug on the left, click open debug launch profile UI, scroll down, and we're going to unselect the launch browser, and then just close that, save, and we should be able to just close the browser. If we run it now, if I press Control F5, it should load the Blazor application and not the server-side one. I mean, it still will run the server one, but it won't launch a web page. There we go. So it's only launching one tab, which is what we want. So now let's begin by implementing a new web API, which will be called to push down one of these employee objects right from this screen. When you hit the save button, we want to call a web API, push this employee to the web API with a new updated values, and then let the API take those values and save them to the database for us, and then respond with an OK or a failure response, so that way the website knows whether or not it was saved successfully. So to do that, let's minimize that. Let's go into the server-side project, the Nuno Solutions employees.server. We're going to open up the program CS file, and we're going to scroll down to the bottom where we have our get employees endpoint. And what we're going to do, we're going to create a new one, but instead of using a map get, we're going to use a map post. So to do that, we're going to add a little bit of space. So we're going to say app.map post. We're going to call this endpoint just employee because we're going to post an employee to it. I'm going to copy this here because we're going to basically create the same thing here. So just to save a little bit of time. What we're going to do in this method is, number one, we have to pass in an employee object. So to do that, we're already passing in the database, which we're going to need in order to save information to it. So we're going to pass an employee. And this is the way you would do it. It's giving you little squigglies because it doesn't know what the namespace is. So just click the little light bulb and then click the using statement. It's usually the top one in the pop-up menu. And when you do that, it'll recognize that class. And you'll see that it added a using statement to the top of the code file. The other thing we need here is access to the HTTP context. Let's add that in there. And I'll show you why we need that later. The Nuno Solutions DB and HTTP context are objects that are going to be injected into our API endpoint. I always like to add a try block in here, just in case there's an exception. We gotta define an object that this endpoint's gonna return. Let's go into the Solutions Explorer, go into our shared project, go into our models, right-click models, click add, and then click class. We're gonna call this save employee response. So the save employee response class is what's going to be returned by the endpoint to the Blazor application. So I'm just going to change the modifier from internal to public. So what we're going to do here is we're going to return a public property of an integer called return code, and another property type string called return message. That's pretty much it. That's all we're going to return for this. Save that, and you can copy the class name, go into your program CS file from the server project, and at the top of your new endpoint, we're going to declare a save employee response object, and we're going to instantiate it. The next step is we're going to have to fetch, or at least attempt to fetch, the employee that's being passed into this object from the database to make sure it doesn't already exist. Because if it exists already, we just want to update it. If it doesn't exist, then we want to create it. That's the way this endpoint's going to work. We're going to create a entity framework Lambda expression to fetch the employee from the database. db.employees.where. And we're going to say we're the employee ID, because that's the primary key, guys. If you remember from the last video, That's the unique identifier for the record. And then we're going to want to pull in the first or default value. So it'll either return the record or the object or null. And now we're going to say if the employee is not null, that means it already exists in the database. So we're going to do an update. Otherwise, I'm going to do an else statement here. We're going to do an insert. The insert's really easy, so let's do that first. So we're going to say db employees.add, and we're literally just going to pass the emp object being pushed from the Blazor app to the web API. And of course, we need to save the changes. So outside of this else block, we're going to do a db.savechanges, and we'll save that. And then we want to return whether it was successful or not. So our response object is called RESP. So we're going to say response.return code equals 1. And that just means that it's successful. We'll use response.return code -1 as the failure code. So we're going to add a return message here. And basically, we're in this return message, we're just going to say the employee was updated. We're going to pass in the emp ID. So if we insert a new employee, obviously there is no employee ID. But when you save the changes with any framework, it returns you the employee ID. So because we're setting this return message after the save changes, we actually have access to the new employee ID that was generated. And so we're going to output that here. And also we're going to output the first name, and I'm also going to output the last name as well. The other thing I want to know here, like in this return message, I want to know whether it was inserted or whether it was updated. Let's add a string value here called action, and we're going to set it by default to none. We're going to set this to inserted if it goes into this else block. If it goes into the update block, we're going to set this to updated. And the reason why I want that is so I could put it in the return message. That way, in the Blazor app, when we return this response, we output this return message in the pop-up message box. I'm actually going to change this to created. So now, if the employee exists already in the database and this variable is not null, then we have to update it. So let's begin the update. We're going to say employee.firstname equals emp.firstname. Again, the emp object is the object that's passed into the endpoint by the Blazor app. I'm going to copy that and just paste it down so I don't have to type so much. I'm going to do last name. Doesn't really matter, but this way at least you don't miss any email, phone. So what we're doing here basically is just setting our database object values to the same values that were passed in from the Blazor app. It's probably a better way to do this, but this is a simple way for junior level programmers to really understand what's going on here. It just makes it way easier to understand the code doing it this way. Of course, there are like auto mappers and things like that that you can use if you wanted to. And that's it. So now we're setting all the fields. We're not going to update the emp ID because the emp ID is the primary key and it cannot be changed by us. And at this point, when you get into this section here, you already have an employee ID because the employee object or record already existed in the database. We're going to save that. And now we want to do some error handling here in case this errors out. So I'm just going to copy these 2 lines of code here. And if it errors out, we're going to return -1. And obviously in a production application, guys, you're not going to want to return explicit error messages because hackers can use that information to hack you. So you definitely don't want to do that. This is for learning purposes. So this is how we're going to do it for this video. When we want to return, we're going to be returning the response object. To do that, this is why we needed the context class. We're going to do return. To return the response object, you would do it like this. You'd do context.response write JSON async and then response. And this would return your response object populated. Let's go into the server project. Actually, you can just pull up the launch settings.json just so we can see what the URL is that it uses. So we're going to use this one here, 7284. So you can actually use Postman to test your endpoint. So let me just run the application, and I'm going to put a breakpoint on the top of the code file. So I'm going to launch Postman, and I already have a Postman request already up in here, and I already have pre-created one. This is what we have here. We're posting to the employee endpoint. Our endpoint is called employee/employee. And our URL is localhost 7284. So in Postman, I'm posting to 7284/employee. We're making sure that we're using an HTTP post method. In the Visual Studio, you will see that I'm mapping a post, not a get, like we have with the get employees. And so let's go back into Postman. And I'm passing JSON payload in the body. In the body of the post message, we're posting a JSON content type, and we're passing in an object of JSON data. You'll notice here I have employee ID in here. Let me pull up the database real quick, and Let me just run it. I'm already, obviously guys, I'm already connected to our SQL Express database, Nuno Solutions, and then I have the employee object that we created. And so you can see the two records in here. We have a Nuno and a Marco record, and I'm gonna try to update the Nuno record, employee ID 1, using Postman. I'm gonna change the first name to, I'm just gonna add a couple of numbers in here, and then the last name I'm gonna add a couple of numbers here as well. And let's try sending. So I hit send, it performs an HTTP post, hits the breakpoint in our server project, and we're gonna step through this a line at a time, hitting the F10 key on the keyboard. And the default action is none. And the employee that was passed in as a parameter that we posted from Postman and contains an employee ID of 1. So in this line, it's going to try to fetch from the database the employee ID with employee ID 1. And then you can see that it was able to find Nuno Pereira employee ID 1 or emp ID 1. And then since it's not null, it's going to set the action to update it and start updating all the properties for the object that it found in the database. And then once those properties are set, it's going to save the changes to the database. And then we're set returning a return code in the response of 1, which means successful, and a return message showing which employee was updated. And then we're just writing the response back. And so I'm just going to hit continue here. And it's bringing us back to Postman. And then if I scroll this up, you'll see that we received the return code of 1 and the employee that was updated. The change we made was we're setting the first name to Nuno 111 and last name to Pereira 222. If I go into the SQL Management Studio and pull up the Nuno Solutions employees table and then run select star from employees, you can see the first name and the last name for Nuno now were updated. Now that we know that our Web API is working properly, saving the records to our SQL Server database, we want to implement the Save Employee button on the Edit Employee screen. That's this screen here where we're showing the employee information and you could actually update it. And we want to allow the user to click the Save Employee button to update the record in the database. And we're going to pass this employee object to the Web API. The Web API is going to update the record for us in the database and then return a return code of 1 if it's successful. And then once we get that return code of 1 that's successful, we're going to show a pop-up message on the Blazor app to tell us that the update was successful. But let's go into Visual Studio. And then let's go into the solution and then pop open the shared project, scroll down to services, expand services, and then double click on app service. We're going to create a save employee method in here. And this is going to have to be an async method. So we're going to set this to public task. And we want this to return a save employee response object. We're going to call this method save employee. And we're going to pass in an employee object as a parameter. Now let's declare a save employee object that we're going to return. This is going to be the message that's returned. I'm just going to set that to null. And now we're actually going to execute our Web API. But to do that, we have to inject the HTTP client. So let's create a constructor. And now in the constructor parameters, we're going to pass in HTTP client. And I kind of do this in reverse. I use the underscore HTTP because I like to actually use the natural variable name without the underscore when I'm calling the methods on this object. And so in the constructor, we have to set our HTTP object to the injected HTTP object that's passed into the constructor. So what we're going to do here is we're going to call HTTP and we're going to do a post as JSON async. If you don't get this, if your Visual Studio doesn't recognize this method, then that's because you need to add this namespace here, using system.net.htp.json. Very important. Without this, you won't get this method because it's an extension method. Now we have to pass in the URL to our endpoint and the object that we're going to post to the web service. So to find out what the endpoint is, you can pull that directly from the Postman. So I'm just going to grab the URL directly, which is right here. And the first parameter is the URL to the endpoint, which is that. And then we're going to pass in an employee object, which is the parameter that's passed into this method. And this is giving me an error because I haven't set the async modifier here on the method signature. The next step is we want to check if the response is successful. And if it's successful, then we want to grab the content that's given to us from the response object, content body, and we're going to read JSON async. We're going to deserialize this to a save employee response object, which is the return type that we're going to be returning. in this method, so that at this point the message should be instantiated with the save employee response. This is the object that's returned from the web API. So now we just want to double check if the message is null, and if it is null, then we're going to instantiate this as a new save employee response, and we're going to return a -1, which is a failure code. And we're going to do a return message as well, and in the return message we're just going to say HTTP response status was not successful. The response was successful, but then we couldn't deserialize the actual response. All right, the next step is we're going to, if the HTTP response code is actually invalid, I'm just going to copy this, and we're going to return another failure response in here, which is also going to be -1. Again, if you wanted to in a real application, you could return different return codes. So really, okay, so let's just change this real quick. This is actually going to be JSON data is null. It's a little simpler to understand. That means the data we got from the content, when I tried to deserialize into our object, it was null because our object is null. And then down here, and we're going to change this, the HTTP response status was not successful. I had these backwards. We got to make sure we return our response object. To do that, all you have to do is this. So the next step is to go into the edit employee razor component, and I'm going to minimize this stuff over here. And what we're going to do is go down to the save employee, and ignore this. This shouldn't have been here. I'll add that later and I'll explain what that is. The save employee method. So in here we're going to say var response, and what we're going to do is we're going to call our save employee method from the app service. And we're going to pass in the app.employee object, because if you remember, our edit form is bound to this object. And if we make changes to any of the fields that our form is bound to, it'll automatically take those. It's two-way binding, so it has those updates in this object. So when we pass this, it's going to be updated. So let's do an if response return code is successful. And then this is where we're going to say show modal equals true. We don't have this variable, we're actually going to add it at the top. This is the one I deleted earlier. It's going to be bool show modal equals false. By default, this is false. What's that modal screen that's going to pop up when it's successful? When this says set to true, it's going to pop up. We're going to add that now. I'm going to use the Bootstrap modal window actually. So actually, we're going to use this one here. We're going to scroll down. This is what the modal looks like. We're going to actually copy the HTML right from here. It's this stuff right here, right? Right underneath our else statement, we're just going to paste that. And we're going to make a few changes. The title, modal title, we're going to change that to just save employee. We're going to get rid of the save changes button. Here, we're going to set the app.employee.firstname, and we're going to copy that. We're going to say the first and last name of the person, and then we're going to say was updated successfully. So last name, and then we're just going to say saved successfully as the message. So now the next step is we have to add an on-click event to these close buttons. And the reason why we have to do that is so that we can set the show close, this property right here, to false, because when this is false then the modal gets hidden. So we're going to do a Lambda expression, and I'm just going to copy the variable name, show modal, and we're going to set that to false. And we're going to use the same exact click event for both of these buttons, because both of these buttons do the same thing. Save that. And now we're going to have to create an expression within the main modal div, because by default the display is set to none. And so what we're going to say here is if show modal, then we want to add a class called show. Otherwise, don't add anything. That's what this expression does. And now we got to go into the app.css file. So let's hide the server project. Let's go into the Blazor client project, expand www-root, expand CSS, and then double click on app.css. And you're going to want to add this class that's in here, a .show, and then just do a display block. That way the modal will be visible when the show modal boolean is set to true. So now at this point we have pretty much plugged in all the code that we need to actually update an employee directly from the edit employee screen. So let's run this, and if all goes well, we should be able to update the records. And we're going to edit the Nuno employee record because it has numbers at the end of the first name and last name. And we're just going to reset this back to just Nuno Pereira. I'm going to pull up SQL Management Studio and just re-execute my select statement. You can see that it has the 3 1s and the 3 2s in the first and last name. And I'm going to hit the save employee. And you'll see that immediately our server, because when I run this solution, I have it set to run both the Blazor project and the server project, except the server project, if you remember, we stopped the Swagger webpage from appearing, but it still debugs it. So let's make sure that the employee object came through properly. And you can see it did. It's Nuno. And it has no 1 1 on the first name, and it has no 2 2 2 on the last name. So let's let this go through. Should find it in the database. This employee object, it found it. And now it should update all the properties of that record, save to the database, and return to us a success message. And you can see we received a pop-up saying that Nuno Pereira saved successfully. Close that. You go to the employee list, and you can see that it's updated here. If we go into SQL Management Studio and re-execute the select star from employees, you can see that Nuno Pereira is now just a natural Nuno Pereira name. And we could do another test. We'll go into Marco, and we could set this to John Doe. And then remember, we can set these fields to anything that we want, because it's going to update the record based on the employee ID or the emp ID, unique primary key. So if we save that, and it's hitting our breakpoint again, I'm just going to remove this breakpoint from the server side and let it run. And now it says John Doe saved successfully. If we go to the employee list, Marco is no longer here. If we go to SQL Management Studio and refresh and hit execute select star from employees, you'll see that now Marco is no longer Marco. He's John Doe. And that's it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching.